Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Patriot's History. I'm the co-author of Patriot's History of the United States, Larry Schweikart, along with Michael Allen. And thanks for watching and for reading our great book, now in its 40th printing, 5th edition. As I mentioned from time to time, people always want to know, where can I get a hardcover copy? Well, not too easily. Only the 2004 edition came out in hardcover. Everything since then has been paperback. So there's that. I am reading, as always, from the 15th anniversary edition. And so if you have an earlier edition, it may be a little bit different. Further back you go, the more different it's going to be. But you can usually find it through the headers. Most of the headers have not changed. So I am operating under the header Lexington, Concord, and War of Chapter 3, Colonies No More. And I am on page 79. And last time we saw that the British had decided they were going to try to clamp down on the colonies, that they were going to try to make them submit. And that the colonies were pretty much united thanks to Sam Adams and the committees on correspondence and the Sons of Liberty and groups like that. So we will pick up with the third full paragraph on page 79. Gage, that's General Thomas Gage. Gage moved when he learned that the Minutemen had a large store of munitions at Concord, a small village 18 miles from Boston. He issued orders to arrest the political firebrands and rhetoricians Sam Adams and John Hancock, who were reported in the Lexington area to secure the cannons from the colonists. Remember that villages at this time made appropriations for their own cannons. Gage, therefore, sought to kill two birds with one stone when on the night of April 18, 1775, he sent 1,000 soldiers from Boston to march up the road via Lexington to Concord. If he could surprise the colonials and could capture Adams, Hancock, and the supplies quietly, the situation might be defused. But the Patriots learned of British intentions and signaled the British route with lanterns from the Old North Church, whereupon two riders, Paul Revere and William Dawes, left Boston by different routes to rouse the Minutemen. And you'll recall earlier that Dawes and Revere were the only two men in all of Boston to belong to all 5 men's social clubs, that they were well known. Their voices were well known. They were trusted. So if you hear Paul Revere's voice crying out in the night, to arms, they wouldn't say the British are coming because they're British. Get your weapons. A fight's about to happen. Paul Revere and William Dawes left Boston by different routes to rouse the Minutemen. Calling to arms, Revere and Dawes' daring mission successfully alerted the Patriots at Lexington at no small cost to Revere, who fell from his horse after warning Hancock and Adams and was captured at one point, but then he escaped. Dawes did not have the good fortune to appear in Longfellow's famous poem, The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, and his contributions are less appreciated, but his mission was more narrowly defined. Once alerted, the Minutemen drew up skirmish lines on Lexington Town Common by the time the British appeared. One of the British commanders shouted, "Disperse, you damned rebels! Damn you, disperse!" Both sides presented arms. That's when you present and you cock your weapon. The shot heard round the world rang out. Although historians still debate who fired first because it was so dark, and the British achieved their first victory of the war. 8 Minutemen had been killed and 10 wounded when the Patriots yielded the field. Major Pitcairn and his force continued to Concord, where it destroyed the supplies and started to return to Boston. By that time, the Minutemen in the surrounding countryside had turned out, attacking the British in skirmishing positions along the road. Skirmishing means the old hide from behind rocks and trees and fire at will. It doesn't mean standing in line and presenting volley fire. Pitcairn sent for reinforcements, but he knew that his troops had to fight their way back to Boston on their own. A hail of colonial musket balls fell on the British, who deployed in battle formation only to see their enemy fade into the trees and hills. American Minutemen were indeed sharpshooters, weaned on years of hunting, but firing at an enemy who moved and shot back was much different than shooting at a bear. Of the more than 5,000 shots fired at the Redcoats that day, fewer than 300 hit their targets, leaving the British with just over 270 casualties. Nevertheless, the perception by the British and the colonists alike quickly spread that the most powerful army in the world had been routed by patriots lacking artillery, cavalry, or even a general. At the centennial celebration at Concord on April 19th, 1875, Ralph Waldo Emerson described the skirmish as, quote, a thunderbolt which falls on an inch of ground, but the light of it fills the horizon. News crackled like electricity throughout the American colonies, sparking patriotic fervor unseen up to that time. Thousands of armed American colonists traveled to Boston, where they surrounded Gage and pinned him in the town. Franklin worked under no illusions that the war would be quick. To an English acquaintance, he wrote, quote, you will have heard before this reaches you of the commencement of a civil war. The end of it, perhaps neither myself nor you, who are much younger, may live to see. For the third time in less than a century, the opponents of these American militiamen had grossly underestimated them. Though slow to act, these New Englanders became, quote, the most implacable of foes, as David Fisher observed. By the way, great book, Paul Revere's Ride by David Hackett Fisher. Paul Revere's Ride, best book out there on Paul Revere. These New Englanders became, quote, the most implacable of foes. Their many enemies who lived by a warrior ethic always underestimated them. As a long parade of Indian braves, French aristocrats, British regulars, Southern planters, German fascists, Japanese militarists, Marxist ideologues, and Arab adventurers have invariably discovered to their heavy cost. That was what Fisher wrote. As the conflict dragged on, however, New Englanders, with the exception of John Glover's main volunteers, did not live up to their early successes, while their southern and middle colonies carried the war. Resolutions endorsing the war came from all quarters, with the most outspoken coming from North Carolina. They coincide with the meeting of the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia beginning in May 10, 1775. All the colonies sent representatives, most of whom had no sanction from the colonial governors, leading their selections to the more radical elements of the colonies. So basically, the people themselves just sent these delegates. Accordingly, men such as John Adams attended the convention with the intent of declaring independence from England. Some conservatives, such as John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, struggled to avoid a complete break with the mother country, but ultimately the sentiments for independence had grown too strong. As the great American historian George Bancroft observed, quote, a new principle, far mightier than the church and the state of the Middle Ages, was forcing itself into power. It was the office of America to substitute for hereditary privilege the natural equality of man for the irresponsible authority of a sovereign, a dependent government emanating from a concord of opinion. Congress assumed authority over the ragtag army that opposed Gage and appointed George Washington as the commander-in-chief. Washington accepted reluctantly, telling his wife, Martha, quote, "I've used every endeavor in power to avoid the command, not only from my unwillingness to part with you, but from a conscientiousness of its being a trust too great for my capacity." Washington didn't think he could handle it. Nor did Washington have the same intense desire for separation from England that burned within Sam Adams or Patrick Henry. His officers still toasted to the health of King George as late as January 1776. Isn't that interesting? All right, I'm on page 81. Sorry, I'm still dealing with these allergies, I've got to tell you. And I'm in the new header, The Indispensable Man. Washington earned respect in many quarters because he seldom beat his own drum. His modesty and self-deprecation were refreshing, commendable, and certainly he had real reasons for doubting his qualifications to lead the colonial forces. His defeat in Fort Necessity, for example. But in virtually all respects, Washington was the perfect selection for the job, the indispensable man of the Revolution, as biographer James Flexner called him. So here's another book. Flexner has been the best Washington biographer. He has a multi-volume series on Washington. He has been the editor of the George Washington Papers, and he has a small condensed version called Washington, the Indispensable Man. Very, very good book. So if you want something on Washington, first place you need to go is James Flexner. Towering by colonial standards at 6 feet 4 inches, Washington physically dominated a scene with his stature enhanced by his background as a wealthy plantation owner of more than modest means and his reputation as the greatest horseman in Virginia. Capable of extracting immense loyalty, especially from most of his officers, though there were exceptions, including some of his generals that were constantly stabbing him in the back. Washington also inspired his soldiers with exceptional self-control, personal honor, and high morals. While appearing stiff or distant to strangers, Washington reserved his emotions for his intimate friends, comrades in arms, and his wife. There's a story of Washington at a social gathering when an acquaintance, not one of his close friends, but an acquaintance walked up and said something to him and slapped him on the back. Washington turned and gave him an icy stare, and the guy just melted away and ran off. And you didn't do that to George Washington. He wasn't a huggy kind of fellow. For such a popular general, however, Washington held his troops in low regard, particularly militia. He demanded clear distinctions in rank among his officers and did not tolerate sloth or disobedience. Any soldier who went absent without leave faced 100 to 300 lashes, whereas a soldier deserting a post in combat was subject to the death penalty. It was said on occasion that Washington stationed sharpshooters behind the army, and their orders were to shoot the first man who ran. So he's a tough dude. He referred to Yankee recruits as dirty and nasty people, derided the dirty mercenary spirit of his men. On occasion, Washington placed sharpshooters behind his army as a disincentive to break ranks. Despite his skill, Washington won few open field battles with the British and suffered several heartbreaking defeats. Nevertheless, in the face of such losses, of constant shortages of supplies and money, and of less than unified support from his colonists themselves, Washington kept his army together, ignoring some of the undisciplined antics of Daniel Morgan's Virginians and the Pennsylvania riflemen, and skillfully avoided any single crushing military debacle that would have doomed the revolution. What he lacked in tactics, he made up for in strategy, realizing that with each passing day, the British positions became more untenable. Other colonial leaders were more intellectually astute, perhaps, and certainly many others exhibited flashier oratorical skills. But more than any other individual of the day, Washington combined a sound mind with practical soldier's skill, a faith in the future melded with an impeccable character and the ability to wield power effectively without aspiring to gain from it personally. He accepted no pay while commander-in-chief, although he kept track of expenses owed to him. In all likelihood, no other single person possessed these essential qualities needed to hold the revolutionary armies together. It is not too much to suggest that if George Washington was killed at Princeton while riding between the lines, there would have been no independent America today. Couple of things about Washington. While researching my book, 7 Events That Made America, I found that at Mount Vernon, in Washington's sheet music that has been preserved, there were, of course, minuets and waltzes and so forth. Minuet was the song style of elites, but there were also a lot of Virginia reels and Scots-Irish folk tunes. And that's important because, folks, that was the rock and roll of the day. Highbrow society people didn't do Irish folk tunes. You danced to them. And it is rumored that Washington was, of course, a very good dancer and was very appealing to the women, despite his teeth situation. So what Washington did was that he understood, as long as he kept the army viable, as long as it was a major force to contend with, he could suffer loss after loss after loss, and it wouldn't matter, because the British couldn't win till they defeated him. It's sort of like Napoleon. As long as Napoleon had a major army in the field, he was a threat, no matter how much the other Europeans outnumbered him. And so when Washington later is retreating down through Pennsylvania and then crosses the Delaware into New Jersey, he was being chased by armies that were many times larger than his. And while he wanted to win a victory, his first goal was to keep the army alive, not have them be wiped out. You see very much the same, excuse me, with Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia. It almost didn't matter what was going on in the West, as we'll see when we get to the Civil War. As long as Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia existed, the North couldn't win the Civil War. They had to defeat him and force him to surrender, and then it was all over. And that's, of course, why Meade was relieved after dealing such a phenomenally deadly blow to Lee's Army in Northern Virginia. He didn't follow up and finish the job. So Washington understands this. He gets his role. His role isn't to go out and win these meaningless, flashy victories over inferior troops. His goal is to keep the army together long enough that the British just give up, which is going to be eventually what happens, more or less. Okay, this is the header. The combatants square off. Washington shuddered upon assuming command of the 30,000 troops surrounding Boston on July 3rd, 1775. He found fewer than 50 cannons and an ill-equipped, quote, mixed multitude of people comprising militia from New Hampshire, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts. Franklin actually suggested arming the military with bows and arrows, which it's silly. I mean, it takes far more training and far more skill to use a bow in a combat situation than it does to use a musket, which is why muskets replace bows and arrows throughout all European armies, because draftees, for want of a better term, could be trained in using a musket in a matter of weeks, whereas bow training took a lifetime, at any rate. Although Washington theoretically commanded a total force of 300,000 scattered throughout the American colonies, in fact, he had a tiny actual combat force. Even the so-called regulars lacked discipline and equipment, despite bounties offered to attract soldiers and contributions from patriots to bolster stores. Some willingly fought for what they saw as a righteous cause or for what they took as a threat to their homes and families, but others complained that they were fed with, quote, promises or clothed with, quote, filthy rags. Scarce materials drove up costs for the army and detracted from an efficient collection and distribution of goods, a malady that plagued the colonial armies until the end of the war. Prices paid for the goods and labor of industry always exceeded those that the Continental Congress could offer and beyond its ability to raise in taxation, making it especially difficult to obtain troops. Nevertheless, the regular units provided the only stable body under Washington's command during the conflict, even as they came and went routinely because of the expiration of enlistment terms. Against a ragtag force mustered by the colonies, Great Britain pitted a military machine that had recently defeated the French and Spanish armies, supplied and transported by the largest, best trained, and most lavishly supplied navy on earth. Britain also benefited from numerous established forts and outposts, a colonial population that in part remained loyal, and the absence of immediate European rivals who could drain time, attention, or resources from the war in America. In addition, the British had an able war commander in the person of General William Howe, and several experienced officers such as Major General John Burgoyne and Lord Cornwallis. Nevertheless, English forces faced a number of serious, if unapparent, obstacles when it came to conducting campaigns in America. First and foremost, the British had to operate almost exclusively in hostile territory. That had not encumbered them during the French and Indian War, so many officers reasoned it would not present a problem in this conflict. But in the French and Indian War, the British had the support of a mostly loyal local population. Whereas now the British movements were usually reported by patriots to American forces, and militias could harass them at will on a march. Second, command of the sea made little difference in the outcome of battles in the interior areas of America. Worse, the vast barrier posted by the Atlantic made resupply and reinforcement by sea precarious, costly, and uncertain. Communications also hampered the British. Submitting a question to the high command in England might entail a 3-month turnaround time contingent upon good weather. Third, no single port city offered a strategic center from which the British forces could deploy. At one time, the British had 6 armies in the colonies, yet they never managed to bring those forces together in a single overwhelming campaign. They had to conduct operations through a wide expanse of territory along a number of fronts involving seasonal changes from snow in New Hampshire to torrid heat in the Carolinas, all the while searching for rebels who disappeared into the mountains, forests, and local towns. Fourth, British officers, though capable in European-style war, never adapted to fighting a frontier rebellion against another Western-style army that had already adjusted to the new battlefield. Competent leaders such as Howe made critical mistakes, while less talented officers like Burgoyne bungled completely. At the same time, Washington slowly developed aggressive officers like Nathaniel Greene, Ethan Allen, and before his traitorous actions, Benedict Arnold. Fifth, England hoped the Iroquois would join them as allies, and that conversely, the colonists would be deprived of any assistance from the European powers. Both hopes were dashed. The Iroquois Confederacy declared neutrality in 1776, and many other tribes agreed to neutrality soon thereafter as a result of efforts by Washington's able emissaries to the Indians. A few tribes fought for the British, particularly the Seneca and the Cayuga, but two of the Iroquois Confederacy tribes actively supported the Americans, and the Onondaga divided their loyalties. As for keeping the European nations out, the British succeeded in officially isolating America only for a short time before scores of European freedom fighters poured into the colonies. Casimir Pulaski of Poland and the Marquis de Lafayette of France made exemplary contributions. Thaddeus Kosciuszko, another Pole, organized the defenses of Saratoga and West Point, and Baron von Steuben, a Prussian captain, drilled the troops at Valley Forge. Excuse me. Receiving an informal promotion from Benjamin Franklin to general. Von Steuben's presence underscored a reality that England had overlooked in the conflict, namely that this would not be a battle against common natives who happened to be well armed. Quite contrary, it would pit Europeans against their own. British success in overcoming native forces had been achieved by disciplined drill and most of all the willingness of essentially free men to submit to military structures and utilize European close order mass fire techniques. In America, however, the British armies encountered Continentals who fought with the same discipline and drill as they did, and who were as immersed in the same rights of Englishmen ideology as the British soldiers themselves had grown up with. It was thus a mistake to view Lexington and Concord with their pitiable shot-to-kill ratio as constituting the style of the war. Rather, Saratoga and Cowpens reflected the essence of massed formations and shock combat, with the victor usually enjoying the better ground or generalship. Worth noting also is the fact that Washington's first genuine victory came over mercenary troops at Trenton, not over English redcoats, though that too would come. Even that instance underscored the superiority of free soldiers over indentured troops of any kind. Sixth, Great Britain's commanders in the field each operated independently and each from a distance of several thousand miles from their troop command center, Whitehall. No British officer in the American colonies had authority over the entire effort, and ministerial interventions often reflected not only the woefully outdated appraisals of the situation because of the delay in reporting intelligence, but also the internal politics that afflicted the British Army until well after the Crimean War. Finally, of course, France decisively entered the fray in 1778, seeing that, in fact, the young nation might actually survive, and offering the French a means to weaken Britain by slicing away the North American colonies from her control and providing sweet revenge for France's humiliating defeat in the 7 Years' War. The French fleet under Admiral Francois-Joseph de Grasse lured away the Royal Navy, which secured Cornwallis's flanks at Yorktown, winning at Sandy Hook one of the few great French naval victories over England. Without the protection of the Navy's guns, Yorktown fell. There's little question that the weight of the French forces tipped the balance in favor of the Americans, but even had the French stood aside, the British proved incapable of pinning down Washington's army, and despite several victories, had not broken the will of the American colonists. All right, that's a good place to stop for next time. We'll pick up with opening campaigns next time. Reminder, this week I will not be here on Friday. I'll be at a homeschool convention, and that allows me a moment to talk about Patriot's history of the United States and the wild world of history. If you have a high schooler in need of homeschool curriculum for US or world, We have full history curriculum with written materials, teacher's guides, student guides, tests, and me teaching 22 videos, about an hour each for US history, 15 videos, an hour to an hour and 15 minutes each for world history since 1775. And all the images that I use, maps, charts, graphs, are all downloadable. The whole mess is downloadable. It's yours. There's no license to expire. Use it with as many kids as you want, as often as you want. So check it out. Also look at the VIP section on the Wild World of History. Has phenomenal resources, extra lessons. Yeah, it costs $6 a month, but hey, there's 5 extra lesson programs with about another 30 videos. Plus you get access to my more than 3 years of webcasts at the Wild Wednesday webcast on topics as different as the Crusades, World War II in the Pacific, the Kennedy assassination, Prohibition, dozens and dozens of topics. They're all for $6 a month. And I keep adding to these. You're not done when you get a VIP subscription. Just $69 a year or $6 a month. Check it out. And then finally, make sure you take a look at the video for turning Patriots history into a video series. It's a trailer that will bring you to tears. I've had grown men say, you know, that made me cry. It's an amazing trailer. Watch the trailer. And if you like it, and I know you will, buy Larry a coffee, $5, buy me 10 coffees, buy me 100 coffees. All the money goes to making Patriots history into a video series. And we're almost to our first milestone. We're a couple thousand away from our first milestone, which is the script for the pilot and the line budget, a necessary item for every single film. So help us out. Check that out. And I will see you guys back here on Wednesday.